Hello and welcome to our inaugural episode of Horror Needs a Hero, this series. This happens to be part 2 of episode 1. My partner Lee has part 1 over on his channel, Drum Dums. We of course would love to be starting this series on a brighter tone, but recent news has us just bummed out a little bit and just kind of down in general about the state of things in horror. In fact, with Lee's half out of the way, we can actually take the information and turn it in such a fashion to help prevail on a point that now more than ever, horror needs a hero. In our accompanying documentary, or prologue at this point, we spoke at length about characters and films that needed to be replicated for horror to be successful again. Films that needed to be made to help bring horror back to prominence. But we often forget that the people performing in front of the lens, the people holding the lens, the people behind the lens, the people in the office with the paperwork making these things happen, they're way more important to the process, otherwise we'd have no film. As far as loss is concerned, 2015 has been an abysmal year for film, particularly horror. We've had some incredibly major losses that actually hammer home the point just how much we need that new era, the next generation, to start. We've had the candles blow out on Betsy Palmer, Christopher Lee, and Wes Craven all in 2015 alone, and will forever be grateful for their contributions. The world, of course, has lost many more people this year. For the sake of the point of our motif of Horror Needs a Hero, we're going to stick with these 3. Betsy Palmer was a fairly popular actor in the 50s for numerous roles throughout television and film, but seemed to have most of her recognition from a show called I've Got a Secret, in which she had a recurring role from the late 50s through the 60s. Over time, her work would begin to dwindle, and by the late 70s, she wasn't really working as much. A complete chance encounter would change her life, the way we saw her, and horror as a whole when she would be offered the role of Pamela for the 1980 horror Friday the 13th, a role she would normally not even think twice about in declining. However, thankfully for the horror world's sake, her car had just broken down, she was in need of money at the situation, and the script happened to come at a really opportune time. She has admitted to taking the role explicitly in buying a new car, the only reason behind her taking that role, and in fact she called the script a piece of shit. Furthermore, she figured, this thing feels awful, who will even see it? But the film ended up doing fairly well. As for the horror genre, Palmer was heralded for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, we had a female in the powerful role of horror villain. This was also a big turn for her, as the film in general had a twist in which you did not expect someone of her stature to take on a character of that type. It has been said that without Betsy Palmer's turn in Friday the 13th, we would not have roles like Kathy Bates in the Oscar-winning performance of Misery. So for Horror Needs a Hero, Betsy Palmer leaves a couple of holes. Although she obviously remains a pillar for numerous reasons, including being the first female villain in a major horror film, a hole that we now have is a bit of a one-hit wonder type thing, but more than that, she was a consummate fan service star, touring many conventions and meeting and greeting the thousands of fans who have grown to love her iconic character. She may have been a one-hit wonder, but most would give up their entire resume to be on the level of Betsy Palmer. Us fans now know it too, because she would come out and spend time with us. It is reasons like that that we need to have something close, because there will never be another Betsy Palmer. In Christopher Lee, the horror genre and film just as a whole loses a lifelong, incredibly working actor and fan base spanning representative. Horror can lay claim to Christopher Lee in the same manner a sci-fi fan can lay claim to him. Roles in films like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars only sit as a center to an incredibly vast planet of material that Lee has created over his career. His life was something of a legendary status, as it was his life that was inspiration for the James Bond character. Christopher Lee was inspiration for James Bond. In all honesty, one could make an hour and 45-minute documentary on Christopher Lee alone and still miss about 3 hours worth of much needed stuff to cover. But for the sake of our standards and principles of this show, we'll praise some of the work quickly. Starting in 1959, Christopher Lee would be the next best thing horror fans had to Boris Karloff. In fact, he was tackling multiple big roles and doing so with some bit of ease. 59 would bring us a version of The Mummy that features Christopher Lee as the Mummy, and while John Carradine was busy playing Dracula, leading into the 60s, and with Bela Lugosi passed on, the new challenge of taking on Dracula would be handed on to Christopher Lee. By today's standards, he would be a bit of an underrated Dracula, but make no mistake, Christopher Lee played Dracula more times than anybody in history. More times than Kane Hodder would play Jason Voorhees, more times than Robert Englund would play Freddy. And not only that, he was playing some darker, edgier versions of the character. I mean, he was in some films where Satan was being used in the title. Such a big thing for the time. A bit of a softer period in time. He was dark before it was cool. Christopher Lee was the underrated crown prince of horror starting back as far back as the 50s. It's kind of hard to understand it, but he was the last multitasking horror icon. Like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff before him, Christopher Lee was tackling numerous major roles. And frankly, we haven't seen somebody come close to it yet. For comparison, it would somehow be like if Robert Englund not only played Freddy, but also played Jason, and played a random Leatherface every now and again. Crazy to think of, right? We've lost a human being with an incredible story all his own, but horror as a genre has lost a multi-talented, multifaceted character actor. Horror will certainly never have another Christopher Lee, but we can certainly use somebody to try. Lastly, we have Wes Craven. Wes Craven represents the very embodiment of the creation process of these great stories and great characters that we grow to love. In the way that Christopher Lee managed to play multiple iconic roles, Craven managed to create and then recreate horror icons in multiple generations and managed to get the entire genre ready to segue into the 21st century. This, of course, was after a generation earlier, he took a modern spin on Mr. Sandman and made it some sort of hybrid of literally the stuff of nightmares. Craven would work with eventual Friday the 13th creators Sean Cunningham and Steve Miner in Last House on the Left, a film that was as brutal and real as people could imagine for the time it was released. Craven would create a series of crucial horror films over his career in films including The Hills Have Eyes, Swamp Thing, the mega hit Nightmare on Elm Street, and of course with Scream. For Last House on the Left, Craven was a writer-director working under eventual Friday the 13th creator Sean Cunningham, but he slowly evolved into a producer and would eventually helm some other great films that have grown in special places for horror fans. Films like Shocker, The People Under the Stairs, Wishmaster, and including the remake of his own The Hills Have Eyes. Wes Craven was able to do so much for the horror genre from so many different aspects of the creation process. Perhaps most valuable of all, without the stories, without the characters being created, we simply have nothing to even talk about. Craven did that. He created characters. He made the films we would grow to love to watch over and over again. He would give us the images that would stain our memories and highlight our nightmares. He'd even seek out stories that weren't his, but needed to have light shed on them, and he would help get those stories produced. Christopher Lee leaves holes in just about any possible scenario you can think of, any category you can associate with the man. He represents an incredible resume, as well as numerous roles spanning numerous genres, numerous fan bases. Christopher Lee was basically working right up until his death too, so above all else, the most important factor, some could argue the fact that he just plain leaves a hole in the roles we'd be seeing him in right now. It can be stated that perhaps he was too far over the map for any one fan base to truly adopt him. But that is the point. An actor who can bring multiple genres together for the simple fact that he's in the films that people differ in opinion on is a joining force in itself. Fans of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings must come together, or dilute their disputes when reaching Christopher Lee. It's the same guy. From there, you can work on a different thing to have in common. Baby steps towards universal fandom. With the loss of Christopher Lee, we now need a vast-scaled actor, and for the betterment of fandom, we now need another pseudo-conciliator, an actor for the masses. We now need something close to the incredible gifts Christopher Lee has given us. Again, there will never be another Christopher Lee, so perhaps this is just moot. With Wes Craven, we're left with an incredible series of holes. You can hope for one person to hopefully come close to what it was Wes has given us in one aspect, but in all likelihood, Craven's departure has left us with many holes that need to be filled in the horror genre. Craven was a masterful producer, director, and trendsetter. He'd even given us multiple icons in the modern age, something that for all intents and purposes has not been done in over 40 years. Nobody was able to give the genre of horror what Craven did for it in the last 30 years. Give us one of the big three in Freddy Krueger, then went and reinvented the wheel when things started getting a bit stale in the late 90s with Ghostface and the Scream series. The same way that James Cameron gave us The Terminator, then came back decades later and dropped the mega success Avatar on us, Craven did the horror equivalent. To say that there will never be another Wes Craven is such a silly understatement, but just the way horror needs heroes on screen, we're now learning this year more than ever that we need heroes behind the camera too. We need the heroes that read the scripts. We need the icons, but without the humans to fill those roles, we're just plain out of luck. Frankly, it's the extraordinary humans that fill those iconic roles that we fall in love with. It's a human being that's playing a role that we get enamored with. It's a human being's creativity that guides us to feel the way we do. It's these incredible human beings' recurring work that we find ourselves leaning to in times of a film we're not so sure of. Well, so-and-so is in it, so I'll give it a try. Or so-and-so wrote it, so I'll give it a try. Or so-and-so is directing it, so I'll give it a try. I can trust they'll give me a good time. And lastly, it is these great human beings that come out and compensate us for our love and devotion at these conventions. They'll share a short story, a photo with us, anything that'll make our day, because after all, they are humans, and they know what it feels like to be enamored with something. They know that because they're enamored with our approval. We can theoretically talk about how desperately horror needs heroes right now, but especially in Wes Craven's case, 2015 shows us that before we can talk about what the next big thing is, we need the human beings behind the characters, behind the stories, behind the fan experience. And we need them first and foremost. Not only does horror need a hero on the screen, we need heroes behind the lens, behind the scenes, now more than ever too. I just want to firstly thank Lee for his first half of the documentary. And of course, we must pay tribute to Betsy Palmer, Christopher Lee, and Wes Craven. Thank you. We will be spending our time from here out on more fun topics, as our next episode features me and Lee discussing the best of the big three, Freddy, Michael, and Jason. For Lee, I'm CP. Thank you for stopping by, and have a day.